afternoon. We're back, and we're back with Silvia Mitchell from the art history. No, history, I'm sorry. Everything is art history, I'm sorry. From Purdue. And well, now she also collaborates with the Rey Juan Carlos University in Madrid. We're going to be hearing from her about the historical background of our four protagonists, projects that were completed and parts that are pending completion. You have the floor, Professor Mitchell.
Noelia, perfecto. Importante entender que soy profesora de
It's very important for all of you to remember that I am a teacher of history, not art history. I'm going to talk about the history of these women. So it is a pleasure and an honor to be with you this afternoon. And I need to thank the organizers and perhaps more especially Paloma Malagashan. Thank you for all of your help. And I have to say that it's wonderful to be able to acknowledge Professor Noelia Garcia Perez's role, which is absolutely essential when we think about determining the contributions of royal women to the building of artistic collections that are housed at the Prado Museum. Thank you for having organized this symposium, which is a landmark really in the studies of queenship and the history of women. My presentation today focuses on four queens that are associated to the kingdoms or reigns rather of Philip IV and Charles II. Isabella of Bourbon, the consort and first wife of Philip IV from 1621 until her death in 1644. Maria Anna of Austria, queen also since 1649 until the death of her husband in 1665, and a regent during her son's minority, Charles II, until 1675, and Queen Mother until her own death in 1696. Mary Louise of Orleans, first wife of Charles II, consort from 1679 until her unexpected death in 1689, and finally Maria Anna of Neuburg, the second wife of Charles II and consort from 1690 until the king's passing in 1700. She survived him for 40 years. The underlying premise of this intervention is to prove that just as it is impossible to really determine the origin of these collections of the House of Austria in Spain without taking the contributions of royal women into account, it is impossible to study the history of the Spanish monarchy and of European international politics without them. Europe was organized on the basis of royal households, which resulted eventually in the nation state. The Austrians were stellar in terms of dynastic transitions, which involved continental transformations and global overhauls. In 1516, when they received the two Trastamara lines that were to be linked with the Burgundy and Habsburg lines. In 1580, with the Iberian Union, when Portugal became a part of the Spanish Empire, and in 1700, when the crown of Spain was received by the Bourbons, giving way to the War of the Spanish Succession, which involved a redefinition of political blocs in the continent. These queens and the kings were in the very heart of foreign policy of monarchies and therefore played very important roles in the activities carried out by European diplomacy. Understanding the dynastic capital and the diplomatic context of their marriages is a first step to understand how, once they became queens, they exerted power and influence. This intervention, this address, is based on my own research and on the theories of queenship, also taking into account recent studies of the queens and of the reigns of Philip IV and perhaps more especially Charles II, a period of time that has been the subject of an overreaching historical reassessment. Isabella of Bourbon was born in Fontainebleau in France in 1602. She was the second born of the kings of France, Henri IV, the first king of France, of the Bourbon house, and Maria de Medici. She was a part of the double project negotiated between the monarchies of Spain and France by Philip III and Marie de Medici as regent, and which resulted in the marrying off of the Infanta Anna Maurice of Austria with Isabella's older brother, Louis XIII of France, and the marriage of Elizabeth of France with the younger brother of the Infanta Anna, the Prince of Asturias and future Philip IV. The meaning of these marriages cannot be especially understood. It was the first time that a king of the House of Austria of Spain was to be married to a French princess, but it was the first time that an Infanta of Spain, the older daughter of a king, married a king of France. The diplomatic meaning of this double marriage was tremendous, and thus the exchange of the princesses on the Bidasoa River, November 1615, really became a cultural milestone. Elizabeth came to Madrid at the age of 13, and the prince was only 10 years of age. The marriage was not to be consummated until 1620. We see the importance of royal marriages and the capital, the dynastic capital of these queens. The unexpected passing of Philip III in April 1621 encouraged the couple to become king and queen at a tender age. Philip was only 16 and Isabella was only 18. As of the beginning of her reign, she was to face very delicate situations within the court and within the sphere of foreign policy. The 12 years truce with the United Provinces reached its end weeks after the commencement of the reign of Philip IV. The king, with the support of the Council of State, decided to support the Austrian branch of the Habsburgs in the Bohemian uprising, which resulted in the participation of Spain in the devastating 30 Years' War. This foreign policy, which was aggressive at the beginning of that reign, was to result in many military successes and victories, increasing the king's prestige and reactivating the former rivalry between Spain and France. Surrounded as she was by the two branches of the House of Austria, France began to support its enemies, including princes and states of a Protestant nature, resulting in a diplomatic confrontation that resulted in the Franco-Spanish War, which erupted in 1635. Isabella found herself in the very delicate position of proving her fealty to her adopted family against her birth family. Personally, the relationship of the queen with the king was very affectionate, but she had to put up with his ongoing infidelities. It is very important to remember that the Spanish court never actually instituted the official mistress role, which did happen in France, and the queens of the court of Spain were preeminent, undoubtedly so, in the court. But Prince Balthasar Charles, the only son of the queen who was to reach adult age, was born in October 1629, 6 months after the birth of the most famous and best-known recognized natural child, Don Juan Jose of Austria, whom the king officially acknowledged in 1641 when Isabella of Bourbon was still alive. The challenge that she had to overcome was to compete with a male figure, Gaspar de Guzman, known as the Count Duke of Olivares, who was the valido, or leading minister of the kings, and a very important courtier during the king's life, during the queen's life, and afterwards. Until fairly recently, the first half of Philip IV's reign has been studied from the point of view of the Count Duke of Olivares, but new research allows us to understand that Isabella was much more active than was thought beforehand. During the Cortes of the Crown of Aragon in 1626, and when they were called again in 1632, when the king actually went in person, accompanied by Olivares, it was Queen Isabella who was left to head the government in Madrid, and this was to happen again during the very serious illness of Philip IV in 1627. She also mediated between Spain and France during the War of the Mantuan Succession. In any case, her protagonism of a political nature was undoubted during the deep crisis which resulted in the union of arms designed by the Count Duke of Olivares, according to which all of the constitutional parts of the monarchy should contribute to defense in a proportional manner. This was a very polemic measure. First Catalonia, then Portugal rebelled. Number of territories of the monarchy rebelled, I repeat, in 1640, resulting in what we now may call one of the worst crises that the country survived in that century. During this time, the queen sold her jewels to pay for the war and was actually designated regent on 3 occasions. She, in fact, was the one who gathered provisions and funds, raised funds for the war. This was just as important as activities on the battlefield, and she was essential for her husband. It is important to remember that this uprising of Catalonia was at the same time a war against France, so her role in the government was even more telling. After the dismissal of Olivares in 1643, the king was proud to identify Isabella as her valido, her favorite or prime minister, in one of the letters that he exchanged with his spiritual and political director, Sister Maria Agreda. At that point, Isabella had achieved everything that a consort could aspire to. The mother of 2 children, Prince Balthasar Charles, who was to succeed his father, and Infanta Mary Therese of Austria, who was born in 1638. In 1643, Isabella reached the peak of her influence. She enjoyed the full acknowledgement of her husband as main principal and leading collaborator, and we can say that her only failure was her death before reaching her full potential, because doubtless this would have done nothing but grow. When Isabella died in October 1644, the war against France, which was linked to the uprising in Catalonia and the 30 Years' War, was the monarchy's main concern. The 30 Years' War was to come to an end, but during the peace negotiations in Westphalia, it was feared that the French would pressure the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Ferdinand III, to sign a separate peace with the enemies, thus doing away with Spain's leading ally. The Spaniards counterattacked by negotiating a separate peace with the Dutch, with the aim of taking from France their main ally. They also worked to advance the collaboration of the 2 branches of the House of Austria. Philip IV's younger sister, the Empress Marie of Austria, ever since her marriage with the emperor, was an essential diplomatic link between the Spanish monarchs and the Holy Roman Empire. Her unexpected death in 1646 was a terrible blow for her husband and for her brother, who decided to marry their children in order to ensure that that relationship was not lost. The engagement of Prince Balthasar Charles, the son of Philip IV, and Isabella of Bourbon, and Maria Anna of Austria, daughter of Ferdinand III, and Maria Anna of Austria, was symbolically announced on the same day immediately after the funeral ceremonies that were observed in the court of Vienna for the Empress. The engagement was to last for a few months only, because the prince unexpectedly died in October 1646, but the alliance was defended at all costs. In that same letter, where the king presented his condolences, the emperor recommended that his daughter would marry the king. Despite the difference in age, 30 years, the new engagement was confirmed in the days it took for the letters to cross the continent from Vienna to Madrid. Maria Anna of Austria held a privileged position within the internal hierarchy of the House of Austria. She was the older daughter of an emperor. She was an infanta of Spain. And this explains why the prenuptial agreements for her marriage were based on those between Anne of Austria and King Philip II, going back 3 generations. Upon arriving to the court, about to turn 15 at the end of 1649, Marianne had a head start. She was a part of the royal family because she was the daughter of the sister of Philip IV. She was a direct heir of all of the kings of Spain, but she was also familiar, up to a certain degree, with the etiquette of the court in Spain. She spoke Spanish, which was a language that she had studied and spoken since youth, together with Latin, and she also had political and cultural links within the court. They had been pre-established before her arrival. And she did not have to face a figure such as Olivares, because Philip IV's main minister at that point was Don Luis de Haro, an influential person, yes, but a more diplomatic, a more discreet personality. Although the political relationship between Mariana and de Haro needs to be further analyzed, we know that it was not confrontational, rather au contraire. Then again, Marianne was to marry a man who was much older than she was, with much more political experience. The collaboration between Marianne and Philip IV was limited to a certain degree. Marianne's protagonism was huge in the cultural sphere in the court of the Austrias, and it is why there are many portraits of her in the Prado Museum. There is no doubt that the image of this queen is contemplated by most spectators, most visitors who come to the museum every year. Despite the fact that her image is iconic, her political importance was to survive in the dark for nearly 3 centuries. The trajectory underscores the deep connections existing in modern times between politics, diplomacy, and maternity or motherhood. The birth of her children was to become the axis of Philip IV's foreign policy. In 1651, she gave birth to Margaret of Austria, who was received with great joy by the king and Infanta Maria Theresa, who called her little sister my daughter. But insofar as the royal couple didn't have a man-child, Maria Theresa would be the universal heir. The Council of State wanted to strengthen her position with the ceremony of the oath, which was a step prior to turning her into the official heir, should her father pass. But this was a difficult title to remove once the oath was sworn, and Philip IV, of course, wanted to use the marriage of his daughter, Marie Therese, in his foreign policy. A marriage in France with Louis XIV would, of course, not be at all possible for an heir to the throne of Spain. A possible marriage was studied between Marie Therese and Emperor Leopold I, which would have been appropriate for a queen of the Spanish monarchy of the Austrias, but Philip IV believed that his second wife would produce a male heir in order to be able to proceed with plans. For the following 5 years, Marianne was subject to ongoing pressure until the birth of Prince Philip Prosper in 1657, followed by another male, Ferdinand Thomas, in 1658, which truly spun her husband's foreign policy around. The existence of a male heir encouraged and allowed the marriage of Marie Therese with King Louis XIV of France. This marriage was the basis of the Treaty of the Pyrenees and resulted in the end of the Franco-Spanish War that had commenced in 1635. Thanks to this marriage, there was peace, and the king was able to maneuver in order to provide a solution to that crisis of 1640, the one that was pending, the uprising of Portugal. Unfortunately, the 2 male heirs died, Ferdinand Thomas in 1659 and Philip Prosper, already designated Prince of Asturias in November 1661, but Marianne gave birth to another son, the future Charles II. 5 years after the death of his sister brother was deemed to be a miracle and did all that much more to increase Marianne's prestige. As of 1657 onwards, she had won her place in the pantheon of kings at El Escorial as a mother of a future king of Spain, and her daughter Margaret would doubtless be the heirs to her father. The king's age, his clear physical weakening during the final years of his reign ensured that Marianne was even more of a central figure as a discreet alternative to the king with a long regency about to commence. Philip IV's will was very clear. His wife was left with absolute control over the king and monarchy. That tradition of naming Habsburg women as governors, the authority of women and mothers in modern Spain, the veneration of queens in the Spanish monarchy, the organizing of the court, division into Spanish and female and male divisions was exceptional in modern times in other regencies, but it was the Spanish way. Mariana was to govern with the titles of gobernadora, or governor, and tutora, tutor, for 10 years, ever since the passing of her husband in September 1665 until her son Charles II became of age at 14 in 1675. As head of state, Maria Anna had to deal with a profound crisis, the result of the strategies of Philip IV, which I've just described. Despite the marriage of Maria Theresa and Louis XIV, he was planning an invasion of the Spanish Netherlands, but Philip IV, who keenly desired to recover the Kingdom of Portugal, left the borders unattended and the monarchy teetering on bankruptcy. The first 3 years of government of Maria Anna were very difficult, but it was the difficulties themselves that turned her into a true stateswoman. She negotiated peace with Portugal. She defended the Netherlands from the French invader, this dating back to 1667, with minimum territorial losses. In 1668, the Flemish had gone from 10,000 to 60,000 soldiers. Thus, she was able to work very closely with the 7 provinces and with England. Although her main achievements were in Europe, as a leader with the first pan-European alliances against Louis XIV in 1668 and again in 1673, she was influential also in America and in the Caribbean. She was most influential in diplomatic terms as mediator for peace during the Third War between England and the Netherlands in 1674. She definitely left her stamp on European history and on the Atlantic. In the court, she encouraged a new generation of ministers who are, in fact, diplomats and statesmen of an outstanding nature, and they were all to play an important role during the reign of Charles II. Marianne's matrimonial policies was in accordance with dynastic traditions, but it was polemic. She confirmed the marriage of her daughter Marguerite with Emperor Leopold II, negotiated by Philip IV prior to dying. However, at the beginning, it was not as advantageous in diplomatic terms as expected, because Spain did not receive the emperor's support during the invasion of the Netherlands by France, although he was married to the heir to the Spanish throne. Margaret died in 1673 and left a daughter, the Archduchess Maria Antonia of Austria, who, upon the death of her mother, became the heir to the Spanish monarchy, and these were her rights for the rest of her life. The decision of Marianne to confirm the marriage of this Archduchess with Charles II in 1676 was caused by military reasons. She did not want to lose the support of Leopold I in that second war against France, which took place during her regency. However, it resulted in a violent reaction in court because the Archduchess was a child of only 7 years of age, and this marriage would have meant that Charles would have to wait for years before consummating the marriage and thus having an heir. Marianne completed her regency as stipulated in her husband's will, and she was powerful to an unlimited degree for 1 more year. But the transition was polemic, and the king was unable to impose himself or his ministers or his mother. This strife resulted in a confederation of 22 grandees and the king's half-brother, Don Juan José de Austria, who demanded that the king be separate from his mother. Months after Marianne was to leave Madrid on her way to Toledo, again, the marriage of the king was studied at the Council of State. Here it was Charles II himself who took the floor and showed that he was mature in political terms. The king's engagement with Maria Antonia could not, of course, be broken during the war, but Charles and his ministers debated the situation, and in the fall of 1677, Mary Louise of Orleans, a niece to the King of France, was chosen unanimously by Charles II and the Council of State as the ideal candidate. The king would thus be able to marry an adult betrothed who would immediately give an heir, and this marriage allowed the country to have hopes regarding a long-lasting peace with France. However, we had to wait and see, and the French princess's hand had to be requested. As soon as the treaties of peace of Nijmegen were signed and ratified, Charles III confirmed during the Council of State his intention of asking for the hand of Mary Louise of Orleans in 1679. The ministers approved the king's caution and prudence and recommended that the Queen Mother be a mediator in this rupture of the commitment between Charles and Maria Antonia with her brother, Emperor Leopold I. This resulted in a major change in the court and in terms of foreign policy. In just a few months, thanks to the intervention of Maria Anna in Vienna and Charles' older sister Marie Therese in Paris, the king was able to overcome this very difficult crossroads. The two matriarchs, Habsburgs, one from France, the other from Spain, very skillful diplomats indeed, were able to negotiate the marriage of Charles II and his first wife. This marriage was announced in the summer of 1679 after 2 years of waiting. The court in Madrid oozed emotion and activity, looking forward to receiving the new consort, and thanks to the transformation of the political regime, which was at that point in full swing. The return of the Queen Mother to Madrid was well known. The Casa de Uceda, today the Palace of Consejos and Capitanía General, was being embellished, turning it into a palace fit for a queen. Charles II had already chosen a prime minister, although he was waiting for the right moment to make an official announcement. Maria Anna of Austria entered Madrid on September 27. The king left Madrid weeks after, on October 19, with a cortege of nobles and courtiers going to the border to receive his wife. The couple was to meet in Burgos, where the marriage took place and where their married life began. The newlyweds arrived in Madrid on December the 2nd and moved to the Palace of the Buen Retiro, waiting for Mary Louise to enter the court. This happened in January 1680. Mary Louise was born in Paris in 1662. She was 17 years when she became Queen of Spain. She was, of course, the older daughter of the Duke of Orleans, the brother of Louis XIV. She was a niece, therefore, of the King of France. But it's important to remember that she was granddaughter and niece of two queens of France who had been born in Spain, Anne of Austria and Marie Therese of Austria, who were important, very important within the dynasty and within the monarchies. Mary Louise actually was involved in a moment that brimmed with hope during the reign of Charles II. Marriage was important for women and for men. It was a symbol of transition to adulthood, and this was especially symbolic for Charles II because it put an end to the complicated first years of his reign. When he was 14 years of age, his reign began. At this point in time, the king was 18 years old and was neither under the influence of his half-brother, Don Juan de Austria, who passed away in September 1679, nor his mother's. He imposed clear political limits before inviting her to return to the court. The young king had devised his own political system and had offered the position of prime minister to the Duke of Medinaceli. He was designated as such in February 1680. The marriage was also very important with regards foreign policy of the Spanish monarchy because it put an end to a specific stage in this Franco-Spanish rivalry which held sway during the youth of Charles II. All of this, the presence of the Queen Mother, the arrival of a prime minister, the recovery of diplomatic relations between Spain and France, left their stamp on the reign of Mary Louise. The French identity of the Queen made her seem more beautiful and interesting. Even the Queen Mother wanted her son to see his wife for the first time dressed in the French style, more romantic, and probably resulting in those desired heirs. But it was this French identity which resulted in conflicts and political and cultural confrontations between different personalities. The diplomatic representation sent by Louis XIV to Madrid and the rigid etiquette in Spain resulted in friction. The Marquis of Villars and his wife, the Marchioness of Villars, were accused of causing conflict and of giving the Queen bad advice, and had to leave Madrid at the beginning of 1682. It was Charles II himself who so instructed. As of the very beginning, Maria Louisa's royal household resulted in confrontation between French and Spanish members, to such a point that a number of French ladies in waiting were asked to return to France. But the major obstacle was, of course, her uncle Louis XIV policy. Despite the peace treaty, which was, as I said, sworn in Nijmegen, Louis XIV acted as if it didn't exist. In 1681, he began to invade territories of the Netherlands, which were neighboring to those that had been ceded to him in the treaty, with the excuse that they belonged to him because of territorial jurisdiction. The politics of reunions is how they are known. These invasions were illegal and they were cruel in arbitrary terms. They resulted in the destruction of cities, many of them completely destroyed, and the death of many innocent persons. Charles II declared war on France in October 1683. The War of the Reunions lasted for less than 1 year, and the end result was another peace treaty between the monarchies of France and Spain, the Truce of Ratisbon in August 1684. The sieges of Louis XIV before and during the War of the Reunions resulted in the most dangerous point in time of Maria Louisa's reign, resulting from the general discontent with the French. One of her French ladies in waiting, Nicole Quentin, known as La Cantina, who was very close actually to the Queen because it was her nurse, she was accused of administering abortifacients to the Queen. Although the King, the Queen Mother, and the First Lady of the Bedchamber were informed, but they said this is inconceivable. But the King had to request an investigation. The lady in question was interrogated and tortured by the Inquisition, and although she was declared innocent, she was sentenced to death. The rumors against the Queen were such that it was actually deemed dangerous for her to leave the palace. The populace would destroy businesses associated to the French and would attack on the street those who seemed to be French, until a royal decree was published threatening with severe penalties to those who performed these attacks. All of the demonstrations against Marie Louise and her small French cortege reflected a deep anti-French feeling that was provoked not by the Queen, but by her uncle Louis XIV. By then, Marie Louise had adapted to the court. She had learned Spanish. She had an excellent relationship with the king, who was deeply in love with her. Thanks to this, she was able to control the persons close to her. A political victory, which was important, was her skill in substituting her First Lady of the Bedchamber, the Duchess of Terranova, by the Duchess of Albuquerque. This was unheard of in the history of the court. On this occasion, she was backed by the Queen Mother, who, despite having been identified in France as her possible worst enemy, actually became her best ally. During the crisis provoked by the ladies in waiting, it was Charles II who backed his wife against the theory of her. We see that he commuted the execution of Nicole Quentin. She was allowed to leave France, the country, to return to France with her husband. And they also saw how others in the Queen's house were allowed to remain in Spain and received a pension. The Queen, just as Isabella of Bourbon, was more influential in the husband's court than has been considered traditionally. So we know, for instance, that the fall of Medinaceli, whom Charles was destituted in 1685, was the result of the opposition of the Queen and the Queen Mother. The main minister was the Count of Oropesa, who supposedly did not want to accept that designation of prime minister in order to avoid potential conflict with the Queen. Her legacy was halted suddenly when she was 27. She was riding, she loved to ride, and she fell. This was followed by an illness, probably appendicitis, which resulted in her death in February 1689. She was expected to have had an heir, and peace was in theory to have followed. She had not achieved this, but she was able to consolidate her position in court. She survived the incompetent French ambassadors, and she survived her uncle, the King of France's Machiavellic behavior. She established an affectionate relationship with the king and with the Queen Mother. She was able to retain her French identity all the while. This was undoubtedly a show of power, which unfortunately did not extend to diplomatic relations. At the moment of her death, the relations between both kingdoms were on the brink of war. In 1686, a league against France had been built, the Grand Alliance, including the monarchy of Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, Portugal, Saxony, Sweden, and the United Provinces. And others, such as Brandenburg, Bavaria, and the Palatinate, were also part of the Grand Alliance. In 1689, England joined this league, and this is what resulted in the Grand Alliance and resulted in the 9 Years' War. Whoever was to substitute for Maria Louisa definitely could not be a woman of the French royal house. The election of Maria Anna of Neuburg is perhaps the most peculiar of the four queens whom we are today studying. There were few princesses, and although the lineage was not as it would have been traditionally, she was backed quasi-unanimously. One of the three candidates for him to choose, the king accepted her. She was attractive, and Maria Anna of Neuburg was elected by the majority of the Council of State. The Queen Mother backed her candidacy. She was recommended by Emperor Leopold I, who was married, his third wife, with Eleanor Magdalene of Neuburg, who was the older sister of Marianne's. It was very important that she belonged to a family that was very fertile. His father, Elector Philip William of Neuburg, and her mother, Isabella Amalia of Hesse-Darmstadt, had 12 children who survived 7 older brothers and 2 sisters who were already on thrones. Eleanor of Neuburg, who was Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, and Maria Sophia of Neuburg, who was Queen of Portugal. There was an advantage, no French blood in her veins, and another advantage is that the Palatinate was one of the members of the Grand Alliance against France. They had been invaded by France in 1689. The marriage was agreed upon months after the unexpected death of Mary Louise of Orleans. The new king traveled by sea. It was very complicated, very dangerous. There was war, terrible weather, and she did not reach Spain until the end of March of 1690. The itinerary in Spain brought her from Ferrol to Valladolid, where she met the king. The marriage took place, and the couple spent their first days as a married couple there. As of the very beginning, the king and queen proved to be compatible, and it was expected that the marriage would bear fruit. The Queen Mother received them at the Real Sitio del Pardo in May. The couple arrived in Madrid on the following day, taking up residence at the Palace of Buen Retiro until their formal entry into the court, which happened in May 1690. Now, Marianne of Neuburg, as a queen of Spain, reigned during a very difficult series of years. The issue of succession was important. The court, diplomacy, foreign policy focused on the heir. The queen consort was in a delicate situation. The reign of Charles II has been and continues to be the object of study, and we know that Marianne and Charles lived as husband and wife when they were both in good health. So every dizzy spell, every craving, every missed period, every sign of a possible pregnancy would elevate the queen consort, and then she would tumble down. It would be a false alarm. It's also important to remember that until 1696, Marianne of Neuburg lived, if you will, in the shadow of her mother-in-law, Marianne of Austria. She had to share with her, she had to give way often enough. There were confrontations in terms of patronage. For instance, the election of the governor of the Spanish Netherlands. It was the Elector Maximilian II of Bavaria who was the Queen Mother's candidate, and not Marianne's own brother, which would have been her choice. It's important also to underscore that both Marianne and Marie-Louise had to survive that negative experience against their cortege. The German clique is how they were known. In 1695, the Council of State was involved, and Marianne had to exile her secretary, Enrique Weiser, and, more controversial, the Countess of Berlipz, a woman who was able to truly benefit from her relationship with the Queen. We know, because the archives have told us, that she worked secretly for the Elector John William of Neuburg and Emperor Leopold I, who were respectively the brother and brother-in-law of the Queen consort, and the Countess obtained great advantages, social, economic, and political, in exchange for creating a tight-knit circle of persons close to the Queen who monopolized her attention. And this, of course, resulted in a loss in popularity. 1696 is an important year for Maria Anna. The Queen Mother dies that year, and the consort takes center stage. But this was the year when she and the king became very, very ill. The Queen first, then the king, became seriously ill. Fearful of the king's passing, the Council of State demanded that the king draft a will. Although the original has never been found, we know that it existed thanks to diplomatic correspondence and thanks also to official papers. And of course, we know that he named successor the descendants of his niece, the Archduchess Maria Antonia of Austria, who died upon giving birth in 1692, but had left a son, Prince Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria. At that point, this was a 4-year-old boy, but he was identified in his first will as the heir. The father of the Prince Elector Maximilian II of Bavaria was willing to defend his son's rights, cost what it may. Charles II's decision resulted in a political confrontation between Bavaria, the Empire, and France, and this, of course, was something that deeply affected the Queen consort. Now, the Peace of Ryswick of 1697 had resulted in the end of the war involving the Grand Alliance against France, and thus the continent focused on Madrid. The Spanish monarchy owned territory, more territory than any other continental power, and controlled a global empire. The possibility of Charles II dying without direct descendants was a geopolitical problem in continental and even global terms. In principle, the key to determine the future of the crown of Spain was the Queen, and she became the mediator, and she definitely backed the Holy Roman Empire, the German one, the monarchy of France, and Bavaria. Emperor Leopold I wanted for the Queen to insist to the king that his younger son, the Archduke Charles, should be chosen. The representatives of Maximilian of Bavaria offered a generous pension and an important role in the court if she defended the candidacy of Prince Joseph Ferdinand as king. The French delegation sent by Louis XIV was concerned about her power, and they also made diverse proposals and offers, some unrealistic. At the end of her reign, we can see that the Queen's position oscillates, hinges between power and danger. The death of Prince Joseph Ferdinand in 1699 wipes the Bavarian option from the table, and the king then finds himself at a crossroads. The options that Charles II had were determined by a number of generations of women and by female succession. After the disappearance of the line of Margaret of Austria in Bavaria, the main options depended on Maria Anna of Austria and her descendants, the Holy Roman German Empire, and then the heirs of the monarchy of France, and that would be Marie-Thérèse of Austria and Anne of Austria. The decision as to what to do resulted in deep rifts in the court. In 1699, an uprising in Madrid, which was known as the Mutiny of Cats, resulted in a change in the political regime within the Council of State and the dismissal of the final representatives of the German clique of Mariannes, especially the departure of the Countess of Berlipz from Madrid. The death of the king in 1700 was a very important event in global terms, in European terms, and for his wife, of course. In view of the treaties that were agreed upon behind his back, Charles II took a decision which doubtless was very difficult in personal terms, but so very right from a dynastic and political point of view. He designated heir to the crown the grandson of the King Louis XIV of France, Philip, Duke of Anjou. Two conditions. He had to accept the entire inheritance, renouncing his rights to the French throne. If he were not to accept, the offer then would be made under the same conditions to the second son of Leopold I. And thus Charles II could impose his will because his decision had all parties needing to accept his conditions if what they sought was a legitimate transfer of power. Thus, he defended the integrity of the Spanish monarchy. This decision was made public in November 1700 on the day the king died. The future of the queen then was in the hands of his successor. Louis XIV accepted Charles II's conditions, and thus his grandson, the Duke of Anjou, became the new king, and the queen acknowledged him as Philip V. During this reign, despite the difficulties she had to deal with, Maria Anna of Neuburg was able to exert an influence on the course, and she was in fact a patron. She attracted key Spanish aristocrats. Her influence was especially obvious after the death of Maria Anna of Austria. She had a warm relationship with the king. She protected him on a number of occasions from doctors and exorcisms that he was subject to. During the final years of her life, the queen was probably one of the very few sources of joy for Charles. We need to remember that she supported the king. He left her a very generous pension of 400,000 ducats. This is 100,000 ducats more than what his father had left his mother, Queen Maria Anna of Austria. Maria Anna of Neuburg was studied with suspicion by the new dynasty and the new king. Before his arrival, Philip of Anjou asked her to leave and move to Toledo, where she lived for a number of years. She abandoned the court. The War of Succession worsened her situation, and Philip V exiled her. She was mandated to leave Spain in 1706. She lived in Bayonne in the south of France for 30 years with a house of approximately 100 persons. She lived a peaceful, pleasant life, surrounded by music, and very much beloved by the local population, although, of course, always supervised by Philip V, who read her correspondence. When her niece Elizabeth Farnese was to become Queen of Spain as second wife of Philip V and became Queen of Spain, the possibility came to the surface of returning to court, but it was not negotiated until 1739. And she passed away in the Palace of Infantado in Guadalajara in July 1740. She had made good upon her desire to return to the territories of the monarchy, where she actually was the final, last queen consort of Spain during the House of Austria, the Habsburgs. So 2 of the 4 queens had the privilege of being buried in the Pantheon of Kings in the Royal Monastery of El Escorial, Isabella of Bourbon and Maria Anna of Austria. Tradition says that only mothers of kings may be buried there. Maria Anna of Austria gave birth to the final monarch of the House of Austria, Charles II, and we know that Philip IV made an exception when Isabella's son died as a prince, not as a king. However, both queens created this dynastic configuration that was to have an effect on the history of the Spanish monarchy, going well beyond the limits of being a mother of kings. And thus, we consider the daughters as well as the sons of queens. The daughter of Maria Anna, Marguerite of Austria, for 3 generations maintained those rights. She died in 1673, and they were inherited by her daughter Maria Antonia. And upon Maria Antonia's death, they were passed on to Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria until 1699. He was the sworn prince. Her daughter, Maria Therese, transmitted those rights to the next dynasty, in 1683 when she passed away. Maria Anna and Isabella were essential during their reigns and after their deaths. They left a legacy of a political nature which was essential. Although Mary Louise and Maria Anna of Neuburg were not mothers, they were actually able to perform a central political role in Spain and in Europe. This degree of power was based not only on personal skills, of course we're talking about skillful women, but also the system, because in structural terms they had a place guaranteed because they were consorts, they were the representatives of their birth families, they were independent political figures, they were mothers, actively or potentially as governors, and in one case as head of state and stateswomen, completely in control of the monarchy. Their reigns were determined by different political contexts in Madrid, internationally, because of the dynasty of origin, but also because of other activities beyond their control, health, maternity, and the personalities of kings at different stages of their own political and personal evolution. I believe that what is most important, and I hope to have convinced you of this, is that these political lives deserve to be studied and analyzed, not only because of themselves, but also because they are a fundamental part of the history of the court, the Spanish monarchy, and international politics in Europe. Thank you very much.